Good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to see this wonderful crowd. So I'm going to give you a little bit of overview about what we're going to talk about, and then I've got a few remarks. I know that y'all all came to hear me talk, but I know you really didn't. You want to hear Tom. But I do want to, just a couple of things. So I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about my experience with the Fed, which has been fantastic, and then we'll turn it over to Tom. He's going to give about 10 minutes of prepared remarks and then Q&A. So please be thinking about your questions. There's a lot out there. So my involvement in the Fed goes back a number of years. I first started and really met Matt Martin. Matt's been a long time, really, and Matt has always been wonderful about speaking to various groups in the Carolinas. That's probably where we first met. I imagine I asked you to speak somewhere, would be my guess. Yeah, Young Bankers, that's it. And then in 2011 or 12, I was asked to serve on the Community Investment Council, in Richmond. And really that's part of the learning that I've had with the Fed is that we all think about inflation and rates and that work that the Fed does, but the Fed does so much work in the community. And I know all of our nonprofit friends here today understand that, but a lot of people don't. And that council or that what really was out there to try to help the Fed understand what was going on in all of our communities. And so that was a big part of my work there. And then I became a part of the Beige Book. And so for those of you that have heard of the Fed Beige Book, it's the sort of how the economy is going. It's about every 6 to 8 weeks. And they ask business people around the country about economic conditions. And so I was one of those people that got a list of questions every 6 or 8 weeks, and I'd fill it out and send it back. And that became the genesis for the Beige Book for our district, the 5th district, but it would go on and be accumulated across the country. So that's the Beige Book work. And then the Fed Board, and I'll tell you, I just started this work this year, and what an incredible experience and what an eye-opening experience. Of course, everybody in this room is active in the community. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. But the ability just to learn, I mean, it is such an incredible group of people, not only my fellow board members, but just learning from all the wonderful talent at the Fed. It's been a great experience for me as I've gone through that. And I'll wrap up by saying some of the things that I didn't understand as well as I should. And maybe the biggest is that the role of these boards, of the Fed board, and Tom will talk about this, I'm sure, but it is totally a bottoms-up organization. And so Tom's working throughout the quarter or the 6 or 8 weeks to understand at a very much of a ground level what's going on in the economy. And it's our job as board members to ask those questions of you. And I might have asked some people in the room, hey, what's going on in your world? Because I need to understand that. And when we go to our board meetings, we have 8 meetings a year, that's the biggest part of the meeting. We learn something. Well, of course, we'll get an economic update, but a big part is going around the table and talking about what we've learned or what we understand to be the situation on the ground in the economy in our area that, wherever we're coming from. And then when we had a little bit of a training session, and Jay Powell, of course, chair of the Fed, is virtual, and he spent 10 minutes, and you can think about Jay Powell, you see him on the news all the time, he spent 10 minutes thanking us, literally. 10 minutes of just thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand about what's going on in the economy across the country. And you should really say nothing more about the work that the Fed does in trying to understand at a really base level what's going on so they can make informed decisions. And that's the key to it all. And so it's been a great experience. And the other part I would say, just to emphasize again, the amazing work that the Fed does in the community, trying to understand the community and what's going on, and then the programs. There's some incredible programs. So anyway, so that's enough about my experience. So I'm going to introduce Tom Barkin. He is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. He's been in this role since 2018. And Tom is on the Federal Open Market Committee. It's the Fed's monetary policy group that you read about all the time. But he also is part of the Richmond Fed, also handles IT operations for the rest of the system, which is incredible. I didn't know that. I do know it now, but I didn't when I came on the board. And then also Tom's involved in supervision as well, because guess what? They're also bank regulators. Very important role. And so our district, the 5th district, so the 12 districts out there, so ours is North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, D.C. and Maryland and a part of West Virginia, or is it all of West Virginia? All of West Virginia. It is all. And anyway, great background, brilliant guy. He came from McKinsey, so he was COO of McKinsey, spent a long career there. He's a Harvard undergrad, Harvard MBA, and a Harvard JD, so quite a distinguished academic background. But most of all, Tom's interested in what you have to say, and that is really what I've always appreciated about him so much. So Tom, thank you, and we'll do some Q&A in a few minutes.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Thanks, Sam, for that nice introduction and for your service to us, which we really appreciate. It's great to be back in Greenville. Now, to be fair, Carlos, you know this, I've been in Greenville many times over the last 2 years. I just want to say some of you are taller than I remember and some of you are shorter than I remember, but all of you have lost weight. I thought I'd just give a few minutes of what I think I'm seeing in the economy. These are my thoughts and only my thoughts, so I'll be direct. But I really am better answering questions than I am just preaching at you. So hopefully with Sam we can get some stuff, and I hope to learn what you're saying. In particular, if I say stuff that you think I'm wrong, I'd actually love to hear that, or maybe Sam would love to hear that. So I'll just start with some context, because I think it's important to remember that the 10 years before the pandemic were the most stable 10 years in recorded American economic history. GDP ranged from 1.5% growth to 3% growth, all positive. We had job growth in every month of the 2010s after the end of 2010. Inflation varied in the incredibly narrow range of 1% to 2%. And so we got used to a level of stability that, of course, we're no longer seeing because COVID changed all that. You know, I like analogies a lot, and when I try to think of the impact of COVID, the only one I can come up with that really speaks to it is the aftermath of a war. Because as you know, a war upends an economy. The government spends massively. Labor leaves the workforce, sadly some permanently. Manufacturing plants are reconfigured to make weapons. Consumers shift their spending to support the effort. And when a war ends, economies struggle to get back to normal. There's often a fiscal hangover. Soldiers need retraining. Plants need to restart with supply chains fragile. And amidst all this adjustment, at least if you win the war, consumers spend freely. And so if you go back through time, what you'll see is at the end of every war, we've had extreme inflation, followed, in most cases, by a recession. After both World War I and World War II, inflation rose above 20%. And most of us remember the post-Vietnam 70s. So with deep apologies for anyone who's actually experienced an actual war, it's worth just taking a second and thinking about the aftermath of the war we just engaged on COVID. $6 million of fiscal stimulus has hit the economy. Workers have stayed home. Participation is still well below pre-pandemic levels. Many have died. Businesses have struggled with meeting demand. Supply chains proved vulnerable to the virus, and consumer spending shifted in a lockdown world. Post-vaccine, just like after a war, consumers have been exercised. We've all been revenge spending. And all of this has been exacerbated by an actual war, the war in Ukraine, that's driven up commodity prices. And so when you look at the inflation numbers right now, they're quite high. The CPI is at a 40-year high of 9.1%. The Fed's preferred metric, the PCE, is at 6.8%. Now, at first, all these inflation pressures seemed temporary. They were driven by the pandemic, they were driven by supply chains, they were driven by the lack of chips in cars. But inflation has persisted, it's risen, and it's become ever broader based. So the Fed's responsibility is to do something about that. We need to reduce inflation, we need to stabilize expectations, and that's what we're doing. You've likely seen that over the last 4 meetings, we've raised rates 225 basis points. We've started shrinking our balance sheet, and we've signaled there are more rate increases to come. And I just want to say now, and I'll say at the end too, we're committed to bringing inflation back to our 2% target, and we'll do what it takes to do that. Now, the Fed's tools don't work immediately. They work over time, so you shouldn't expect inflation just to plummet back to 2% suddenly, and certainly not predictably. As I talk to businesses, I talk to some that are in oversupply and trying to think about how to put goods on discount, but I'm talking to businesses that still have cost pressures or margin squeezes and are still thinking about how to raise prices. After you've had a decade of stability and you replace it with 2 years of volatility, it's like the aftershocks of an earthquake. It just takes a while for this amount of volatility to settle down back to target. But I do see inflation coming down, and I see it coming down in 3 different ways, 3 different lanes. The first has to do directly with rates, and that is the demand lane. So as we raise rates, that'll increase borrowing costs. As you increase borrowing costs, that reduces spending, especially in interest-sensitive sectors like housing. And as the demand comes down in that, you ought to see prices come down. And we are starting to see some of that, some precautionary softening in business investment, and we're starting to see reduced traffic in home sales. Real consumer spending was basically flat in July. Second lane is supply chain. And here we are starting to see pandemic supply chain challenges heal, because pandemic pressures, we are actually going to get to the other side of this at some point. On the margin, weakening demand should help as well. That'll give businesses time to hire and some space to catch up on inventories. And we are seeing that. You're seeing freight costs decrease. You're seeing a bunch of big retailers say they're over inventoried. And you're seeing employers having more hiring success. But the phrase whack-a-mole is used a lot. I just think it's going to take time for these supply chain challenges to settle. The third lane is commodities, things like oil and wheat. These have been most affected by global events. They're the ones that the Fed has the least impact on. But over the last couple months, you've seen the dollar strengthen. You've seen gas prices come down. You frankly see the broader range of commodity prices coming down. And hopefully they too will normalize, and we won't have further shocks, things like a natural gas shutoff in Europe, for example. Now, these 3 lanes are hard to forecast, so it's hard to know exactly when you're going to get inflation back to target. And as a result, our efforts to bring inflation back obviously raise the question of, are we going to go into a recession? So let's talk about that. I mean, I understand why people would be concerned about going into a recession. Business sentiment is low, consumer sentiment is low, largely driven by inflation. Rates are increasing, and when rates increase, that often can tip an economy into a recession. The markets are skittish, and if the markets were to pull back significantly, people could pull back on spending. Oil prices are high, and typically when oil prices rise, there's a recession. There's lots of uncertainty in the world, and so there are lots of reasons why one might imagine there's a recession. There's so much interest in this question that Wikipedia last week, actually suspended editing on its recession page, because so many people were going on and editing and re-editing and re-editing and re-editing what the definition of a recession is. I'm going to try to avoid giving you a technical definition of a recession. What I will tell you is there's a real reason to be uncertain about it, and that is because the data that's coming in is inconsistent. It's wrong. We just don't know exactly which way it's wrong. What you're seeing right now is GDP coming in flat to down. We've had 2 successive quarters of negative GDP, even though the numbers are a little bit noisy. You're seeing employment come in quite strong, including last Friday where we added 528,000 jobs, which is a historically monumental number. And so it just doesn't make that much sense to have GDP come down and employment be that strong. It implies a productivity loss of proportions that we have not seen, right? And so maybe that's what's happening. I don't see any evidence of that level of productivity loss, but the data we get is late and it's revised. It's often revised 3 times. And so I think as we go through the revisions, we will see some combination of the GDP numbers coming up and or the labor numbers coming down, and we'll just have to get to the other side of it. And so the way I pull it together is I say there's a path to getting inflation under control. A recession could happen in the process, but nobody canceled the business cycle. And so it's just important to keep the topic of a recession under some sort of in perspective. Right, we're out of balance today, and we're out of balance today because stimulus-enabled spending has overwhelmed supply chains that were stressed by the virus and stressed by global events. And so I like to think of returning to normal not as some calamitous decline in activities, but more as waiters in restaurants and products on shelves. And I just think that's a healthy way to think about it. We're going to have to keep baselines into perspective as well. Equities are down, I think, 13 or 14% this year, but of course they were up 40 or 45% in the 2 years before. We may or may not have a decline in housing prices. If we do, just remember they've been up 45% as well over the last couple of years. And so I try to keep a hard look at the pre-COVID baseline numbers as opposed to what things looked like yesterday. But most importantly, doing what we do to moderate demand has a higher purpose. And that higher purpose is squarely in the mandate and squarely what you want us to do, which is we're trying to control inflation. And if there's one thing we've relearned in the last 12 months, it's that we hate inflation. We all hate inflation. And why do we hate it so much? We hate the uncertainty it causes. It's hard to know when to spend or when to invest or where to invest. Inflation's exhausting. It takes time to go shop suppliers. It takes energy to go negotiate with customers. It takes energy to try to push back on suppliers who are trying to raise prices. And inflation seems unfair. If you just got a wage increase, you think you earned it, and then you go to the pump and the gas station's taking it away from you. If you're a business and your value proposition is so strong you can get a price increase, you wonder why you have to give that price back to your aggressive suppliers. If you're selling a house, it's great, but if you're buying a house, it's not. And so we're after the topic of stabilizing expectations and bringing inflation back to target. If we do that, that creates the certainty that businesses need to invest in growth for the future, and that'll enable maximum employment. As a reminder, we got inflation under control after World War I. That's what supported the Roaring '20s. We got inflation under control after World War II. That supported the prosperities of the '50s and '60s. We didn't get inflation under control in the '70s, and I don't think anybody wants to relive that. So the Fed is committed to getting inflation under control. We may or may not get help from global events or supply chains, but we've got the tools and we've got the credibility we need, and we're committed to doing that. And with that, Sam, I'm open to questions, challenges, any thoughts?
All righty, let's see. Are we going to pass around this mic, Jennifer? This is for you all. But I do have 3 prepared questions, not prepared, you all somebody sent them in ahead of time, so we're going to read those, we're going to ask those real quick, and then we will open it up. And these are the, I guess, folks in the audience that sent in before. Let's see if I can get this right. We'll make an easy. Oh, that's an easy one. Not an easy one, but anyway, a good one. A good baseline one.
You can generally tell when he's hesitating that this is not my most friendly question. I'm really looking forward to this.
All right, here we go. This is good. What is he? Tom, what do you think about keys to driving down inflation?
Well, so I talked about the 3 of them, and just a simple answer is, it'd be great to have commodity prices come down. Obviously global events have a lot to do with that. Getting these supply chains things fixed is absolutely imperative. Getting these supply chain problems fixed is obviously a big deal. And then the Fed taking rates to a level where it quiets demand so that demand and supply get into better balance. Those are the 3 things.
All right, and this is going to go more on the community side, and this is a great question. Given it's a little bit long, but bear with me. Given the current economic climate, what strategies should we consider or are implementing now, the Fed, now to support members of our community who are already struggling to make ends meet or who are now challenged based on inflation? Are there any policy opportunities to help address inflation that's out there, basically?
Well, so the way I think about it is we have inflation today not because people want it, it's because demand's a lot more than supply. And so there's a set of things the Fed can do around demand reduction, which is what I've been talking about. But I think anything that works the angles of increasing supply is good for inflation. And what does that look like? Well, the most obvious one is workforce. And I know you guys have done a lot of work over the years in workforce, and certainly in South Carolina and in the upstate in particular. I think you guys are growing in ways that most of the country isn't in terms of workforce. But we still need more. And employers are short, and I think things that get people off the sidelines are well worth thinking about. So I'll just throw out some thoughts for you. Women in the workplace. The U.S. Was tied with Canada for the highest participation of women in the workplace in 2000. Today, Canada is 8 points higher than we are. Participation of those 55 and up. Japan has 16 percentage points higher participation of those 55 and up than we do. Bringing people into markets, workers into markets. When I talk to folks who are struggling with that, the number one thing they talk about is housing and access to housing and what people are doing in terms of getting affordable housing for workers. So all of these are things that are worth thinking about, and we could go into bringing people out of prisons and into work, or off of drugs into work. All of these are things that I think communities are thinking about, your community is thinking about, and should be thinking about. Because I think the challenge we're going to have going forward, the biggest challenge is actually the supply of labor. And how do we get more and more people into the workforce? By the way, I also believe that's good for the workers. So if we get people off the sidelines and into the workforce, I think that's also good for them and good for us.
And I think big part there, Tom, I think, is that we are, as we work to as the Fed works to understand the communities, we can, we do inform organizations, and I think a big part of that is making sure we're doing a good job gathering info, and then the Fed gathers it, makes some determination, and shares it, which I think is really, really good. And I think this next question, I think it actually is a good segue, and you may have already really answered it, but can you share factual information regarding certain industries, food service as an example, having such a difficult time finding staff? Are people not working? Have many of these people actually found alternative work? Any thoughts there on the participation rate?
Right, so I'll walk around this a bit. So fact number one, we have exactly the same number of people working in the economy today as we did in February 2020. So the workforce is back to its pre-2020 levels. I should say that before 2020, it was on a growth path. And so there's still a gap between where we are and where we would have been if we had kept growing, right? And the two big sources of that gap are we had a significant drop in immigration during COVID because you wouldn't let people in from other countries. You might have diseases and visas had problems and all the rest of that. And that's almost 2 million. And the second 2 million is people 55 and up, whose participation dropped significantly. And you can understand why. That was the segment most worried about COVID. Maybe they're taking care of their grandkids. Maybe their 401ks got them into a point of retirement. Maybe their employer early retired them. All of those are things that happened. But regardless, we have 2 million fewer people in from other countries and 2 million fewer people 55 and up in the workforce. So we're back to where we were, but we're 4 million below where we could or should be. And that's part of why workforce seems tight. The other issue is, while many of our sectors are back to normal, some are back to super normal. And what do I mean by that? I think Amazon built 150 warehouses during COVID as online shopping spiked. And so they hired a lot more logistics and transportation people. And those people had to come from somewhere. Remember, same number of people working, so yes, they came from somewhere. The two segments that are down the most right now, the number one is still leisure and hospitality. And if you're at a hotel, you'll see that in service levels, and if you're at a restaurant, you'll see that in wait staff and service levels. That's definitely. The second one, interestingly, is state and local government, who's down. And that's a little strange because the funding's not down. But what's happened there, and I'm speculating now, but I think that segment's probably the least able or willing or easy to shift wages quickly when demand goes up. And sometimes because the tax revenues aren't available, and sometimes because it's a policy process, it's a political process. But regardless, lots and lots and lots of attrition in state and local governments that is showing up in some places in service levels as well.
That's great, thank you. The last one is sort of a loaded question. I'll see how you respond to this one. Is the Federal Reserve's current approach to inflation and monetary policy the right approach, or do you suggest others that might be better for long-term economic prosperity in the U.S.?
I think it's the right approach. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, there you go. Good answer. All right, so we'll open it up, and I'll repeat the question, so we'll make sure everybody hears that. So what other questions do we have from the audience? Anyone? There we go.
Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten Naomi Chapman. I'm with United Way of Greenville County. Thank you so much for being here. I am a newbie when it comes to stuff. So my question is really about the gap in wealth between folks who earn lower incomes and who earn higher incomes. And from what I read, that's actually not great when you look at kind of the arc of modern history in the U.S. How might that influence the potency of the Fed's tools to reduce inflation, considering from an article I had read this morning that the impact on those who earn lower income versus higher income may be a little bit different. So lower income folks might stop spending as much, but higher income still spend at the same rate.
Okay, thank you for the question. Oh, did everyone hear that?
Y'all hear it?
Yeah. So I'd put it this way. When economies go into recession, the people who are hurt first are the lowest income people, and that's true across recessions. When inflation hits, the people who are hurt most are the lowest income because they spend a higher percentage of their earnings or their net worth on goods. And of course, food and gas prices matter a lot more if you're just struggling to get by than they are if you've got a lot of money in the bank. And so at this point, unlike maybe some others, I don't really see the goals in conflict. I think we have to take care of inflation. That will be good for low-income people. That will be good for everybody. And if we can take care of inflation, that then frees us up to, use our other tools to try to help promote maximum employment, which will be good for low-income people and good for everybody. So that's how I think about it at this point. But it's quite striking when you get into the numbers. And I guess it just makes sense. If you spend 100% of what you make, then inflation is going to hit you a lot more if you spend 60% of what you make.
Great question. What other questions do we have? Anybody? Oh, there we go, Dave.
Hi, Tom. Dave Edwards. Just a quick question. Some would say and speculate that the Fed waited too long to start hiking rates. So now that you've gone up 225 basis points, is the Fed going to be a little bit more, continue to be aggressive, I would say, because as we know, going back to that time frame when in the 70s, rates went to 16, 17, 18%, whatever. I think I bought my first house for 17 and a quarter in 1982. So, and I felt really good the next year when it went down to 11 and a quarter. So, but just curious how you all are going to continue to approach that, and could we see rates that really go that high?
I think it's unlikely that we're going to repeat 1982. Here's how I'd put it. So the first part of your question is, did we wait too long to raise rates? And we'll see, what we learn. I think I like the process of going back into what we did and asking myself the question of, if you had perfect information now, what would you do differently? And for sure, and I think I was probably speaking to you guys a year ago, we were just out of COVID. People forget that the inflation rate in February 2021 was 1.5%. Vaccines were rolled out, people were spending, inflation first started to spike, and it seemed temporary. And it seemed temporary because 80-90% of inflation at that point was 5 goods. It was new and used cars, they didn't have any chips, and it was travel, hotel, and rental cars coming back to normal. And so nobody raised rates then, but with 2020 hindsight, who knows? And I think the real miss was 2 or 3 months later when the workforce didn't come back. And most of us, or at least I thought, that had a lot to do with the stimulus programs. And people were on the sidelines because the stimulus programs was keeping people on the sidelines. And so we waited a few more months thinking the workforce would come back, and it turns out it didn't come back. So I think it's totally fair to say that was an assessment that with 2020 hindsight was wrong. You're trying to make choices in real time. That's what I'd say. In terms of how high we go, a lot depends on inflation and inflation expectations. Why are we raising rates today? We're raising rates because inflation's high, and we're raising rates because you don't want inflation to stay so high that people start to expect you're always going to have this kind of inflation. And so you want to raise rates over the level of inflation expectations so that real rates are positive, so that you diminish spending to the extent that you do. Now, I've been pretty pleased with how inflation expectations have responded to our rate increases. And so if you look at my colleagues who predict every quarter what they think they're going to do, I think the center of the range was rates would get into the 3.5 to 4 range, something like that. We'll reforecast in September, so there'll be fresher numbers in a month or so. But nobody was forecasting rates are going to go to 15 or 16%.
Question.
Hey, Tom, Gage Weeks. I'm with Hollingsworth Funds, of which Sam is a board member, so thank you, Sam, for bringing Tom here. All of us in this room are change agents to some degree or another. And I, for one, within our organization, have utilized a lot of the Fed's tools from a research perspective. So whether it's tapping the FRED database or a number of us have paid close attention to the racism in the economy series that you all have had. Could you share with us a little bit more about the tools that our regional Feds offer and the kinds of things that we ought to be tapping and using that you all offer beyond just hearing about, various forecasts and stuff like that, which obviously is important. But they're real tools, I think, to Sam's point, that we could all access and utilize that I think would make us all better leaders here and help us create the change we want to see here in Greenville.
That's great, and I can always tell a real Fed nerd when they're on Fred. For the 99% of you who don't know what Fred is, it is the St. Louis Fed keeps a database of all the economic data going back through history. So if you're ever working on a model or anything where you want to find out what was inflation in 1975 or what was unemployment growth or any other economic variable, they keep it all in a very easy to access. So that would be a good example of that. And we'll figure out a way to get you guys an invite to join, our website, because you're not getting enough spam as it is. But we actually publish a lot of really interesting stuff, and we work very hard to make it topical. So what you'll get from us, and all the Feds do some version of, taking our brilliant economists and trying to turn it into normal everyday English in terms of disparities like we were talking about earlier, the wealth gap. We've got one in Richmond tomorrow on aging workforce and what that means for the economy, breaking down some of the data that comes out, some of the inflation data that comes out. What do you take out of all this? And so I think there's a lot of very interesting things that are worth doing. And so for those who are interested, we'll figure out some way to get you access to the website, voluntary only, but you can log in and see it. There's lots of good stuff. And we've got the research teams in our banks are like a top 30 university economics team. So we have real researchers, and hopefully you value that because we're trying to figure out what's happening in the economy. And we really are working hard to take their research and bring it to our constituents.
What else, folks?
Jason Jones, the chair of the Department of Economics at Furman University, so I apologize, it's a little academic.
Oh no, nobody told me there was going to be a plant here who actually knew whether I was telling the truth or not.
So I'm really interested in, you piqued my interest about productivity and what you've described with the increase in employment and the drop in GDP is statistically the numbers will say a drop in productivity. But that's not what I think of when we think of productivity, about how much we're actually producing, the capability of being able to produce. So a little bit of your comments about what is happening actually in productivity, is that a concern, particularly beige book predictions about what's happening on the ground? And how are we going to explain away that what we might see in the numbers, which if it doesn't match, which I imagine it's not going to match?
Yeah, so I won't get overly technical because actually the economics profession has a definition of productivity which is broader than just labor productivity. So they're also talking about capital productivity and innovation. But just for simplicity, I'm going to talk about labor productivity, understanding that it's a narrower definition. And labor productivity is how much output do you get for so much input. If you remember back to the 90s, or if you remember to the late 80s, there was an economist who famously said, you can see the impact of computers everywhere but in the productivity statistics, because computers were out, but they weren't making us more productive. In the 90s, they started making us more productive, and we had a 10 or 15 year run in the 90s through the mid 2000s where productivity in this country really surged. And surging productivity is massively good for everybody. It increases lifestyles, it increases compensation, it increases everything you want to increase. Most of the data would suggest that in the 2010s, productivity came down meaningfully. And so, we were sort of slogging along through the 2010s. And again, the question of, is all this technology we've created to improve our lives somehow sapping our productivity instead of increasing it? I guarantee you that's true for my 23-year-old. Maybe you guys have a 23-year-old who's also looking at their phone right now. But I don't know. COVID has been a very difficult process to try to understand productivity because, what happened? Well, the crisis came and a lot of people laid people off, but they still had work to do. So did the productivity just surge? And then you bring everyone back, but people rotate from goods to services, and productivity just drop. And right now, there is a story out there that says It's so hard to get workers that the marginal worker I'm bringing in is not very productive, and so that's a problem. There's a story out there that says, I've been working like a dog for the last 12 months to try to hire to fill my open positions. I'm not going to be too fast to shrink, even if my revenue is coming down. So there is a potential story that productivity is dropping now, but the numbers it would have to drop to make today's data reports valid, I just think are too big to be real. And so I really do think you're going to see the GDP numbers revised up, and you're going to see the employment numbers one way or another revised down, and that will help explain that gap. But I'm giving you what I think. There's, the best evidence of what the numbers are is actually what the numbers are, not what I think. I'm just telling you what I think.
Great question.
How about the health of the banking industry?
Yeah.
Recognizing your regulatory role, good stuff to be worried about, things that you would like to see the banking industry tackle?
Yeah, great question. So the question is health of the banking industry. And I'd even say more broadly, we're all built to think that next time is going to be like last time. And next time is almost never like last time. So last time, and now I'm talking about 2008, 2009, that was housing and mortgages, that was the banking sector. That's not this time. That's not this time. Leverage in the housing market is very low. Defaults in housing are extremely low. And banks have more capital by some measure than they had beforehand. And bank default rates are extremely low. So, we're not seeing that at all. Now, it's a fair question, what do you worry about on the banking side? And of course, I worry about cyber, because something that sort of felt to you like someone was shutting down access to your net worth seems like that would be a pretty top of mind kind of issue. And so we're very much worried about or concerned about making sure that stays in a good place. The other thing I worry about more, I guess, long term is, are we going to learn the right lessons from 2020 or the wrong lessons from 2020? And the right lessons for 2020 are banks had enough capital, banks acted quick enough and conservatively enough. The wrong lessons would be, when you have a downturn, small businesses never go under. When you have a downturn, people don't default on their loans, because there was so much stimulus placed into the small business sector and into the consumer sector that we just didn't see default rates like you normally see in a downturn. So I trust and hope the banking sector is not going to learn that. We're regulators. Our job is also to help them make sure they don't learn the wrong things as well.
All right, folks, we have time for a few more. It's like 10 minutes. What else? Anybody? All right, well, I'm going to ask one more. But I just thought it was interesting on Friday.
I was thinking the game is ended early because of
No. Got to answer one. I was holding this. No, and it's not a big question, but it's interesting to me, and I almost had to chuckle a little bit, how good news can be bad news. So Friday's job announcement was just such a shock to everybody. And although it didn't really happen, but the stock market's going to go down today because they're worried about what the Fed will do with this info. So just a little thought about how good news becomes bad news and why that is, and does the Fed respond differently to the good news that we had the other day?
Well, I'll just say, I try really hard to do my job without looking at the equity markets. Because what we're trying to do is pretty unrelated to the equity markets. The equity markets are trying to NPV future income streams, and most of the value of a stock comes after our horizon, right? It's after 2 years. And so we're trying to decide whether to increase rates 25 basis points or reduce them 25 basis points. They're trying to decide what the valuation of Amazon is. Those are not the same thing. And so I just kind of stay out of it. I think most of it's flow of money. Now, I do pay attention to the debt markets, to the bond markets, because the way we're trying to transmit policy is through rates. And so if we're increasing rates and mortgage rates go down, it's not happening the way we want it to. Or if we raise rates and borrowing rates go down, it's not happening the way we want to. And so I do pay attention to the bond rates. And in particular, these are highly informed people making bets on future inflation. And so you really do want to hear, as best you can from the numbers, what they're saying in terms of where inflation's going. So I focus on the bond markets and how they move. I try to stay away from the equity markets.
All right, hope everybody brought their umbrella. Any last minute questions? Anybody? Tom, thank
Well,
you.
Thank you,
so
and I'd
much.
just be
It was
interested,
awesome.
if anyone sees anything in the economy I ought to know about, I'll stay around for a while. I'd love to hear any insights. Thank you.